that the United States had a long-term interest in having a strategic relationship with Pakistan, that it wasn't just a transactional relationship about dealing with the terrorism problem of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I think we never really succeeded in that respect.
In South Asia, between Central Asia and Pakistan. I would want the Chinese to come into that. Pakistan cannot afford camp politics. I want to make this point strongly.
That the United States is going to disinvest in the Middle East, has less at stake in the Middle East, and is going to focus more on Europe in dealing with Russia and Asia in dealing with China. Well, that has had an effect on the diplomacy in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is now China, not the United States. And that gives China an incentive to play more actively in the Middle East, not only economically, but diplomatically.
Hello and welcome to Infertalks, a podcast where we put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining us today are two former national security advisors, Mr. Stephen Hadley, who served as an NSA in George W. Bush administration, and the editor and author of his latest book, Handoff. And our second guest is Dr. Moeed Yusuf, who served as the NSA in Prime Minister Imran Khan's cabinet. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
Let us start our conversation, and for that, I would go ahead and indulge Mr. Hadley, first of all. Mr. Hadley, let me ask you, you've written different books in the past also. What makes your recent book, Handoff, different than the previous ones?
Well, thanks for having me on the program. I appreciate it very much. The book is really kind of a different kind of book. Its core is the declassification and publication of 30 of the 40 transition memos that the Bush administration prepared in 2008 and 2009 for the incoming Obama administration. We took those 30 memorandum, they're being published in the book, unchanged, just the way they were given to President Obama. But we then had the persons who wrote those memorandums or who worked on the subject of the memorandum, whether it was Iran, Iraq, India, Pakistan, terrorism, proliferation, whatever it was, the persons who worked on that issue then updated that is to say, they provided a postscript to the transition memo that said what happened subsequently under the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. And then based on that, how did the Bush administration do? What did we get right? What did we get wrong? And then finally, looking back under 20 years under 4 administrations dealing with the issue, what are the lessons learned for future presidents? Because all of these issues are still with us today. So it's kind of a resource book on how these issues have been handled by the Bush administration, subsequently over a 20-year period, and hopefully can be a resource for people who want to understand better the foreign policy of the United States during this period of time.
So now let me ask you one more question, and this is more about the position of the NSA itself. So let me ask you, what is the role of the NSA in the US government in particular? Does it simply deal with hard power related issues, or are non-traditional security areas a remit of their office as well?
Very good question. The National Security Advisor is a position in the White House, working directly for the president, isn't Senate confirmed, doesn't testify before Congress, really helps the president perform his or her role in national security and foreign policy. National Security Advisor does that 3 ways. 1, supervises a staff of anywhere from 200 to 300 people that support the president, help him speeches, help plan his travel, help prepare him for meetings and all the rest. Secondly, runs the interagency meetings of representatives from the various departments and agencies that pull together options for the president, help the president make decisions, and then implement those decisions. And the issues that come into that interagency process are not just hard power issues. There are really 2 kinds of issues. One, issues that are of particular interest to the president, where it's a presidential initiative. For example, the president's initiative dealing with PEPFAR in Africa, dealing with HIV/AIDS, the so-called PEPFAR program, dealing with HIV/AIDS in Africa. That was something that went through the interagency process because it was a presidential initiative, but again, did not deal with military or hard power. And the other kinds of issues that get into that interagency process are issues that require multiple agencies of the government in order to be effective, and require, therefore, the kind of interagency coordination among various agencies of government that the NSC, National Security Council, is supposed to do. And the last thing the National Security Advisor does is provide his own independent guidance and advice to the president when the president asks for it. That's really what the role is under the US system.
Okay, now, Dr. Moeed, let me indulge you over here for a comparative perspective. And let me ask you, how different was the role of the NSA before you joined the government? Was there any difference you brought to the office, including your experience with bringing out the first ever national security policy of Pakistan?
Thank you, Sama. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be sharing the space with Steve. Look, I mean, I think the US system has matured over years and years. You know, the NSA I saw in all my years in Washington, it's a linchpin for the US president. When I came into office, I mean, Pakistan's NSA office has been an intermittent one. It's become important at times, and then you've had no NSAs for prolonged periods. In fact, I'll tell you, interestingly, none other than Steve Hadley and I were speaking, I think, when I just took over. And one of the things he mentioned to me, I still remember, is in Pakistan, the NSA's office is what you make of it. You know, I think every NSA has done this slightly differently. When I came in, I think the biggest challenge that I found in the Pakistani government, and perhaps that's the reason, frankly, I got the job, there was a dearth of strategic thinking. We had no place in government, in no agency, in no department, which was dedicated to thinking long-term. A lot of what I saw was firefighting. And that's where we came up in the NSA's office with this concept of the strategic planning cell, whose job was to look beyond the horizon, think big, think of issues that may not be affecting us today and maybe affecting us tomorrow, or may affect us differently. And that's the starting point of the national security policy. What is Pakistan's direction going to be in 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years, where we want to go? I think that's perhaps the most important piece that we introduced while I was there. The other thing I think is very similar to the US role, which is the coordinator in chief, if you will, for the prime minister. I mean, you know, when Steve mentions this idea of running a staff, I wish I had 300 people. I probably had 1/10 of that. But the idea was, how do you bring all ministries together on the same platform? When the prime minister instructs, how do you follow up and make sure things happen? So those are the two big things. Other than that, you know, diplomacy and national security dialogues and all of that continued. But the strategic part, you know, I think if we don't know where we want to go, everything tactical is going to make just as much sense as it does without a goal in mind. So I think, if anything, that was the big change, at least when I was there.
And let me also ask you, you did try to democratize the process of policymaking in Pakistan as well by trying to improve coordination with think tanks, not just in Pakistan, but also outside of Pakistan. And if I recall very correctly, you also initiated this web portal where people can actually send in policy recommendations, especially academics and think tankers. How did that fare so far?
Sama, again, I mean, that, you know, that's my entire career as we spent there. And one of the things I've always stressed to Pakistani policymakers, even when I was not in government, Pakistan is completely missing from the international intellectual map. Go to any big forum, any big conference, Pakistan's not present. But when I started looking at this, what I realized was that we didn't have any real connection between local think tanks and the government. You know, in countries like the US, UK, many other countries, it's a very well-oiled machinery where the think tanks produce input for the government, which is then taken up, analyzed, and then either implemented or not. We were missing that link, that conveyor belt. So when I started looking at this space, I realized, how can a government, any government, make policy without getting real cutting edge input from your best experts who are usually not in government in countries like Pakistan. So that was the thought process behind it. We did create that link. We did end up with the Islamabad Security Dialogue, which is sort of Pakistan's statement to the world in terms of security fora. And again, I hope these things do continue, because I am convinced that no government in the world today, but definitely with our meager capacity, unless you get the academia and think tanks linked up with policy, we will always have mediocre policies implemented and naturally then mediocre outcomes.
Now, Mr. Hadley, let me come back to you and speak about, transfer of power and the transition of policy itself. Let me ask you then, how did you and the team actually grapple with that challenge of transferring institutional memory and policy consistency to Obama administration? Don't you think this culture has gone through some aberration recently from Trump to Biden administration? What's your view of that?
Well, it's been a long process. The first transition I participated in was from the Ford administration to the Carter administration. And what was interesting about that transition is that there was no transition. There were no memorandum prepared. Indeed, all of the documents that had been used by the National Security Council staff in the Ford administration disappeared. They went to the Ford library. So when Zbigniew Brzezinski, as National Security Advisor, walked into the office for the first day of the Carter administration, he had no staff and no documents and no memorandum to tell him what were the issues of the day. So that's where we started. And as Moeed said, the US process has matured over time. And I think in some sense, it attained its most sophisticated form to date under the Bush administration. Why was that? Well, it was because President Bush knew in early 2008 and called in Josh Bolten as chief of staff and said, when the new president comes in, and at that point we did not know who that would be, they'll be faced with two wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan, the war on terror. And that was before we knew that they would also be faced with the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. And what President Bush said was, they're going to have a lot on their plate. Our job as an outgoing administration is to put them in the best position so that at day one of the new administration, they're in a position to handle these issues that will be their responsibility. The reason it worked was because the two President Bush, the outgoing Republican president, and President Obama, the incoming Democratic president, wanted it to work, wanted it to be a good transition, and sent that guidance and direction to their two teams. And their two teams worked together on a bipartisan basis to try to put President Obama and his team in the best position possible when they entered office. So I think that the critical thing is the incoming president and the outgoing president need to want to make the transition work. And I think subsequent to that transition from the Bush to Obama years, you haven't had that kind of cooperation at the top level between the incoming president and the outgoing president.
But what about the transition that took place from Trump presidency to Biden presidency? Don't you think there was some form of an aberration compared to your previous experience, where that transition was quite smoother?
I think it was an aberration, and I think it came out of the particular circumstances of that election, but also, quite frankly, the particular personality of President Trump as the outgoing president. He took, as you know, as history has shown, it was a very reluctant and in some sense never really accepted the results of the 2020 election, and therefore was not really of a frame of mind to want to smooth the transition to President-elect Biden, who he thought was not duly and fairly elected. So I think it underscores the basic point that if you're going to have a good transition, it's got to be because it will only happen if the incoming president and the outgoing president have agreed to work together to ensure a smooth transition of power.
So now, Mr. Hadley, let me come and ask you about another war in fact, one of the major wars that the Bush administration had actually undertaken, and that was right after 9/11. Let me ask you, did US go in Afghanistan without clear mandate after 9/11, despite ending up with development after 20 years in Afghanistan? We saw an embarrassing exit, unfortunately. If you were to do this, or if you were given the opportunity, how differently would you do this on a second opportunity?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think the way I'd like to answer it, if I can, is sort of looking back at the American military intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Vietnam before that, and in some of the interventions that have been elsewhere by other countries in the world, and say, what are the lessons? What are the takeaways? What are the lessons learned from those interventions? And I think there are a number of them. One is that international authorization is very important. The United Nations Security Council is a principal way of doing that. We had that in connection with the intervention in Afghanistan, which, after all, was a response to the attack on the United States on 9/11, which in many ways originated from Afghanistan. There were threats that there would be follow-on attacks against the homeland, and the United States needed to then go into Afghanistan to eliminate the Taliban and to be able to their control of the country so we could get at Al-Qaeda that had been after 9/11. So we had the UN Security Council authorization in Afghanistan. That was a very good thing. We also had it in Iraq under 17 UN Security Council resolutions. So international authorization is important. Second of all, I think one of the conclusions is a local partner that is legitimate, that is supported by the people of the country, and is able to provide effective governance. If you don't have a strong local partner, it's going to be very difficult to stabilize a country after a military intervention and put it in a direction of security and prosperity. Third, I would say, if there is a neighbor next door that is providing safe haven to terrorists or to insurgents in the country that you're trying to stabilize, that's going to make it much harder. And we saw that in the case of Vietnam, for example, North Vietnam with respect to South Vietnam. We saw it, regrettably, in the case of Afghanistan, where there was a fair amount of safe haven taken by terrorists and the Taliban in Pakistan that have facilitated their abilities to resist the American intervention in Afghanistan. Fourth, I think if you're going to stabilize a post-conflict situation, a post-intervention situation, you've got to help with local security, you've got to help with local governance, and you've got to help get the local economy going and providing jobs. And these are tasks that the local country has to do, which the United States could help. But we did not have the kind of civilian capabilities that really were required to provide maximum assistance to the people of Afghanistan for those tasks. That was an inadequacy of what we were doing. And finally, I would say one other thing. If you're going to do an intervention, as we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, as we did in some sense after World War II and in Japan after World War II, and also in Korea after the Korean War, if you're going to stabilize those post-conflict situations, it's going to take a long time. It's going to require not just years, but decades. It's going to require the support of multiple American administrations of different parties, support of the Congress, support of the American people. And if you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult to succeed. And we lost that in the case of Afghanistan. And that, I think, is one of the things that resulted in the decision that President Biden made.
I want to sort of expand on what Steve has said, because Afghanistan still remains, very important in terms of the conversation on the relationship. I would put what Steve has said slightly differently in terms of the context and sitting in Pakistan and looking at this. I've always argued that Afghanistan was about two countries, the US and Pakistan, having very hardcore realist policies, which at some level clashed with each other. But we spent way too much time pretending that all our goals aligned. Actually, they didn't beyond a point. And I would argue, and I would put it differently, this point about the neighbor. I think it's crucial for whoever is intervening to understand the stakes and the interests of the neighbor. I think that is one area where, from the Pakistani perspective, it wasn't as important to know what the US wanted to do as it was to know that the US understood that Pakistan had a view of the region that was being affected by the way the US was administering the war. I think the international presence grossly underestimated Pakistan's concerns about India's presence. Now, it's one thing to say how much it was, whether it was exaggerated, whether it was understated, but the policy of the neighbor or any country in the region is going to be driven by their perception of the threat. And I don't think US and Pakistan, to be fair, ever could align their views on who was the real, where the real threat was coming from in the long run, at least for Pakistan. Whether it was going to be Afghanistan, whether it was going to be the Taliban or the Pakistani Taliban or India. And I think the larger geopolitics, the US sort of move towards India affected or clouded that conversation throughout. If we had a different approach to thinking about the region and what Pakistan's concerns were in terms of Afghanistan, I think this could have gone in a different direction. The other thing I would say, I think where perhaps a rethink could be done is history. Understanding the history of the people and the context in which we operate. I remember in 2003-4, already there were conversations in Afghanistan where the US, despite the international mandate, was being declared an occupier, quote unquote. That wasn't anything that was happening in the war. That's the history and the context of the people of Afghanistan, especially the Pashtun belt, the war of the 80s. And there's too much history there, I think, that perhaps was not entertained as we went ahead. But all said, I think what is done is done. Too much time has been spent trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong. I actually want to stress another point here. Because of Ukraine, because of where the world is going, I think Afghanistan is yet again the forgotten theater and the forgotten conflict. We've made this mistake collectively as the international community, all of us, in the 90s. My worry now is that, the sense is that the Taliban are there, they're not playing ball, it's difficult to deal with them. Let this be an Afghanistan or a regional problem. The issue is that IS is gaining ground in Afghanistan. We can see that. The TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, is constantly attacking the Pakistani state. There is evidence that they've also teamed up with the IS from time to time. Afghanistan is at the brink of, the World Bank said, 97% poverty, which means that you could literally have a collapse of the economy, a major humanitarian disaster, a major migration, outward migration flow again. This is deja vu. This is exactly the kind of scenario that got us to the 90s and unfortunately, ultimately to 9/11. So I can't stress enough how important it is to move beyond the past and for the international community to come together beyond just providing humanitarian aid, because I just can't see this working out for any of us if we just forget it and let it be.
Thank you for that insight, Dr. Moeed. But now let me bring the conversation back to another major war that was undertaken by Bush administration, Mr. Hadley. Let me ask you particularly about the Iraq war. And if I were to ask you, somehow the war in Afghanistan was pushed to the back burner or was somehow forgotten. This is how critics actually describe it as such. How did that affect the US and ISAF's ability to accomplish counter-terror objectives in Afghanistan?
I would say that the Iraq war did not push Afghanistan in the background. Certainly in the years of the Bush administration, we were spending a lot of time on both of these conflicts because we were thought they were integrated into the war on terror, which was a real threat to American national security interests as we tried to confront terrorists. I do need to say a word, not to relitigate the past, but I think I should probably provide our listeners a more American perspective to what Moeed said. So if you'll indulge me, let me say just a couple things about it. And I'll talk about the past because I think it tells us something about the future. I think one of the mistakes that America made was we never were able to convince Pakistan that the United States had a long-term interest in having a strategic relationship with Pakistan, that it wasn't just a transactional relationship about dealing with the terrorism problem of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I think we never really succeeded in that respect, and that provided a context for the relationship that was made it quite suboptimal. And the American perspective was that we actually saw two Pakistans with respect to the Afghanistan war. One Pakistan that was cooperative in the war on terror. We have to recognize that Pakistani security forces lost more lives than anybody in dealing with the problem of terrorism. So at one level, Pakistan was an ally in the war on terror, fighting its own battle against terrorists for its own purposes. But at the same time, it was clear to us that Pakistan was affording safe haven to Al-Qaeda and to the Taliban, and that there was then sanctuary for terrorists in Pakistan, that complicated our efforts to bring stability and security to Afghanistan. I think we never really were able to solve that schizophrenia in the American view of the Pakistan we saw. What does that mean now going forward? One of the things we used to say to our Pakistani colleagues was, there are no good terrorists and bad terrorists. There are only terrorists. And if you think there are terrorists who can be your ally for your own strategic purposes, at some point they will betray you and they will come after you as well. And I think in some sense we're seeing that with the Pakistan Taliban, which are now a threat to Pakistan. And make no mistake, the United States has a real national security interest in the stability of Pakistan, in a secure and safe Pakistan that is able to provide stability, security, and a better life for its people. So one of the questions for the relationship going forward, and Moeed had urged us to look forward, is can the United States and Pakistan and sit down and have a conversation about the nature of their relationship, and a relationship that will be based on more transparency and candor, that will have reflect the strategic interests the two countries have in each other, and can help and assist Pakistan to face the current terrorist challenge it faces, but also the economic challenges it faces. I think that is the kind of conversation we need to be having between the United States and Pakistan, and I think we are not having today. And I think that's very unfortunate.
Gentlemen, I'll definitely come to the nature of relationship that both countries ought to have. But before that, Dr. Moeed, let me ask you. Many in Pakistan have this impression that they think that they were used in the previous Afghan war also, despite all of the blame game, even in the recent war. Why did Pakistan then become part of the war in the first place?
Sama, look, I mean, I think, again, this is, we can go back and forth on this. For instance, I would argue the one group, Steve, Pakistani Taliban, actually came up as a direct reaction to Pakistan's teaming up with the US on the war on terror. Because, the ideology that was espoused by the groups on the other side of the Afghan-Pakistan border was exactly what was hailed in the 1980s as the saviors and sort of the defeating arm of the Soviet Union, essentially. The groups that defeated the Soviet Union, they were the forefathers of the same, and the ideology was the same. So it was very difficult for people in those regions who had housed these people for decades to suddenly overnight now declare them terrorists. And that's the reaction that brought the Pakistani Taliban. It was never going to be a group or groups that came together that the Pakistani state would ever have any interest in. But leaving that aside, I think some of the point here is what Steve has made. And I think that's exactly right. In fact, I remember Steve and I wrote a piece jointly on this some years back in Washington. And the argument there was we have to have a strategic conversation about what this relationship is beyond the transaction of a security partnership. Because I think in that transaction lies this disconnect, where there isn't enough faith and trust on one side or the other that the other party is going to stick with me for the long run. Fundamentally, Pakistan has been very important for the US and the West whenever there's been a conflict in the region. And then when that's over, we move on, and we think we've been used and abused. There have been sanctions in the past. Fundamentally, the problem is we haven't figured out the strategic direction of the relationship. And one thing I've always said when even when I was in office, you'll remember, Pakistan does have a story to tell. It does have an important place in the world, but it can't, the narrative and the conversation can't be couched in a very narrow security prism. We are much more than that. It's 220 million people. It's a market. The US has interest in this region. I don't think it's true that US investors don't want to come to Pakistan. What is true is that if we work with the US to create that sort of space, I think profit is to be made, and a number of US companies do make profit in this country. So more of that will happen. I think this is really the point. What is the strategic direction? Even when I was sort of working on this along with colleagues in the Foreign Office, we tried very hard. But it was difficult because for so long, both sides had only talked security. Somehow we just fell back every time to blaming each other. And I think this may now be a time where the heat is not what it was when Afghanistan was raging. There is some diversion of attention because of Ukraine. This may be a good time to go back to the table, start looking at what this long-term relationship looks like, frankly.
Dr. Moeed, you've spoken about, storytelling in the first place. So let me then ask you, what's the problem when it comes to, building a strong narrative or building up a narrative that's actually more reflective of the desires, at least on the Pakistani side?
Well, look, I mean, there are multiple things. One, I would argue that, again, the persona, the conversation of Pakistan's always built around negatives, unfortunately. Whether it's nuclear, whether it's terrorism. And I saw this myself in the last 20 years. This happened again and again. How many times did we talk about agriculture in Pakistan, IT in Pakistan, in world capitals? There wasn't any interest. But go back to the national security policy. What did it say? It's saying that Pakistan's future core is going to be economic security. It's going to be looking at building development partnerships with the world. It's going to be looking at connectivity in the region. I would want the US to come and invest in connectivity in South Asia, between Central Asia and Pakistan. I would want the Chinese to come and do that. Pakistan cannot afford camp politics. I want to make this point strongly. Many people ask me that the national security policy, it's very aspirational. You talk about geoeconomics. How can you not be in any camp? See, it's not altruistic. The issue for Pakistan is that virtually all our economic inputs come from China, and virtually all economic outputs and exports go to the West. Our economy is deeply integrated with both. We can't become part of a great power contestation where the elephant tramples the grass. And so we have to broaden this space, have to talk more broadly about everything Pakistan can offer, and then gradually the world has to pick pieces and partner with us. To friends in the US, my point always was, let's get the private sector going, because the public sectors are what they are. If the travel advisories against Pakistan, etc., can be removed, you will see private sector come in and make profit. It's such a large market, they won't ignore it. So that's, I think, the direction to take. It's good for the US, it's good for Pakistan. Frankly, it's good for the region at the end of the day.
If I could say one thing, I'll give you the American perspective on the question you asked, Moeed. The American perspective is Pakistan did not cooperate in dealing with the terrorism threat emerging from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan as a favor to the Americans. Pakistan made its own national security calculation that the terrorism we saw after 9/11 was a threat to Pakistan. And we, the United States, during the Bush administration, and it's shown in some of the transition memos that are in the book that you described at the beginning of this podcast, provided assistance to Pakistan to help it deal with the terrorist challenge to Pakistan, and provided other forms of economic and other assistance to try to help Pakistan establish in areas where terrorism could take root a more stable economic and political structure and governance structure that would make those areas more resilient against terrorism, that would be a threat not to Americans in Afghanistan, but would be a threat to the Pakistani state in Pakistan.
I think, Steve, the leadership of Pakistan at the time would agree with what you're saying, right? I mean, that's where the conversation was. The people of Pakistan, especially the ones on the ground in the bordering regions, had a very hard time accepting that. And that disconnect is where I think some of the backlash came. The TTPs of the world came up and they convinced people that the state of Pakistan was acting against its people's own interests, in cahoots with the US. That's sort of the dichotomy that, I think really brought this backlash, and then it started getting out of control, and the rest better than anybody. So, I mean, I think that's probably the nuance in that.
Mr. Hadley, let me actually ask you on a recent statement that you've made in your recent interview with USIP. You said that had there been prior intelligence, which had actually denied the initial assessment about the presence of weapons, the US would not have gone to war in Iraq. What do you say about that?
I think that's a fair statement. When the president had to make the decision about Iraq, he did so standing on 17 UN Security Council resolutions, which condemned Saddam Hussein and called on him to stop developing weapons of mass destruction, supporting terrorists, invading his neighbors, and oppressing his own people. And the 17th of those UN Security Council resolutions said that he was in violation of those resolutions and promised serious consequences if he did not come into compliance. But of those four things, the one I think that people were most concerned about was the development and possession of weapons of mass destruction. We knew he had chemical weapons and biological weapons as a result of the first Gulf War in 1989, 1990. We also discovered that he had advanced nuclear weapons program. I think it was those concerns and the fact that we did not have evidence that he had dismantled those programs that really was the basic case for going to war. If we had known that, in fact, as it appears to have been the case, that he destroyed his stacks of chemical and biological weapons and had given up his nuclear program, but didn't want to say so publicly because he did not want his historic enemy, Iran, to be aware that he had done those things. If we had known that was the case, I just don't think that the president, even if he had wanted to do so, would have been able to convince the members of Congress to back the use of military force against Iraq. That the members of Congress in both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, on a bipartisan majority, supported the use of force against Iraq. I think if we had known that he did not have those stocks of WMD and did not have an active nuclear weapons program, I think we would not have gotten those votes out of the Congress. And I think the president could not have gone to war.
Mr. Hadley, don't you think critics would then say that, the war in itself and the assessment itself actually led to a dent in the credibility or the moral authority of the US itself? And as a consequence, we see countries in the region, such as Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, having this détente being facilitated or mediated by China in that case.
I think there's an element of truth to what you say, but I think there are a lot of other factors that explain what we're seeing in this kind of new diplomatic environment in the Middle East today. And I'll give you a couple of them. One, of course, is that the United States is less dependent on Middle East oil than it was 10, 15 years ago. And that the principal consumer of oil, for example, from Saudi Arabia is now China, not the United States. And that gives China an incentive to play more actively in the Middle East, not only economically, but diplomatically. And I think you've seen that in China brokering this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to reestablish diplomatic relations. I think another factor, quite frankly, is that you have had the United States increasingly focused on the challenge presented by China, by how to support Europeans as Russia has renewed its invasion of Ukraine. And you've had 3 presidents in a row now, Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden, that have told the Middle East that the United States is going to disinvest in the Middle East, has less at stake in the Middle East, and is going to focus more on Europe in dealing with Russia and Asia in dealing with China. Well, that has had an effect on the diplomacy in the Middle East, and they believe that they cannot rely on the United States as they did in the past. And that has caused the states of those in the region to reach out across the board to all of their neighbors, but also to states like Russia and China. They have a different now approach to their diplomacy, which is to cultivate relations with a wide variety of players and try to have no active disputes with their neighbors. I think there are a lot of factors that have contributed to a Middle East now that has very different architecture and a very different approach to foreign policy. I would say one thing, though. Let's not overstate that, because I think the countries in the region very much still want the United States to play a role in the region. You saw that Saudi Arabia, at the same time, it was talking through the Chinese about developing relations with Iran. It was talking to the United States and Israel about coming up with an Abraham Accord and wanting various U.S. guarantees as part of that conversation. So I think America continues to play a role, but it will be a different role because it's a different Middle East.
Mr. Hadley, let's speak about another region, and that is actually the region of South Asia. The U.S. has a history of intervening in crises between India and Pakistan, particularly over the nuclear flashpoint of Kashmir. Do you think after dehyphenating India and viewing it as a counterweight to China, there's little inclination in D.C. now to resolve the Kashmir dispute?
I think I would state your question a little differently. I don't think I would call it American intervention with respect to Kashmir or the flashpoints between India and Pakistan. I was involved in the efforts by the Bush administration in 2008 to stand down the crisis between Pakistan and India over the terrorist attacks in Mumbai, as you remember. And we were, in some sense, I think, invited in by both countries to try to help them manage that terrible terrorist attack in a way that would not cause the two countries to come into confrontation and conflict. And we played that role in 2008. We had played it in prior crises. I would hope the United States would still find it in its interest to play that role. And I would hope that India and Pakistan would continue to want the United States to play that role. I think for a lot of reasons, it is not a role that either China or India or Russia, for example, would be in a position to be able to play. The issue of Kashmir is very complicated. Various administrations have offered the U.S. good offices in trying to resolve that conflict. The Pakistanis have been generally historically willing to entertain such a role. The Indians have not. And if you're going to play that role, it has to be one that's acceptable to both sides of the conflict. But at this point, I'm not quite sure who could play that role, because as I say, for various reasons, I think Russia cannot, being viewed as much too close to India, and China cannot, being viewed as much too close to Pakistan. But at this point in time, it does not appear that there is an opportunity or a willingness on the part of both India and Pakistan to entertain such a role from the United States.
Dr. Moeed, let me now take you back to the question of Middle East. This recent development that we've actually seen take place between Saudi Arabia and Iran What kind of policy implications are you actually seeing for Pakistan in this case?
Look, I think it's not as important who mediated for Pakistan, but I think what's really important here is what happens to the region. And as a country that's talking about don't want to be part of camp politics, wants peace in the region to build connectivity and have a pivot to geoeconomics, anything that contains conflict, prevents conflict, and makes our region more stable is good for Pakistan. And Iran is a country which has been internationally isolated. Think about Pakistan. We are not in an enviable position. You've got two Western neighbors. Both are internationally isolated, not by Pakistan, but by the rest of the world for different reasons. We've got a perennial adversary in India on the east, and we've got sea to the south. So, that leaves us with China, essentially, where we have a very good relationship. But if 4 of your 5 neighbors, including the sea, are not where we want to be, then what connectivity are we talking about? So anything that sort of opens up Iran, I think is good for Pakistan. But let me just say this. The opening of Iran in terms of the economy has to be with the West on board. It can't be that you have a particular subset of countries agree that Iran needs to move in a different direction, but the greater levers of power and sort of the Western bloc still does not accept that. So I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a larger conversation where everybody can reach a consensus on how to engage Iran positively, and then what to do, of course, about this question of nuclear and relationships in the region. I think it's a good start. If Iran does normalize at some point in terms of the international engagement, it's good for Pakistan. But I don't think we should consider this a sufficient outcome.
So you're making a case for some sense of inclusion for the West as well. Mr. Hadley, let me come back to you. Let's step back a little and see things from a far more macro level. What do you see the state of global peace to be? And are we headed to global competition as, this narrative of competition between US and China heats up, or is in fact moving in that direction? And where does the US foreign policy fit in this?
Well, I think one of the ways to answer that very good question is to contrast, again, going back to the book that we talked about at the beginning. If you look at the transition memos that were written at that time, and look at and sort of ask yourself, what did the world look like at the beginning of the Bush administration? And how does that differ from the world today? They could not be more different. And I think that tells you the challenges we face in the world today. The world that Bush faced when he came into office was one in which the West had defeated fascism in World War II, defeated communism in the Cold War, and the United States emerged from those two struggles as a preeminent power. Great power competition seemed to be a thing of the past. There was an international order based on Western values, so-called Western values, really commonly shared values across many nations, that was widely accepted and really without challenge. And the model of political democracy and market economics seemed to be the only model under which you could base the foundation of a prosperous, stable state. Communism and fascism have been shown to be wanting. That's the world of 2000, 2001. All of those parameters have changed. We now have the reemergence of great power competition with China and Russia. Russia, a revanchist power that has invaded its neighbors. China, a power that is now taking a much more active role in the world and using its economic and military muscle to, in some sense, intimidate its neighbors and assert its own interests in the world. Those two countries challenge the international system, and they have offered their own authoritarianism as an alternative to political democracy and market economics, the Western model. And the United States, while still a major player, relatively is less powerful than it was in 2000. So I think the world is a much more changed place. I think greater competition between China and the United States is a thing that is here to stay. And the question is whether those two countries can develop some guardrails, if you will, or common principles that allow them to manage that competition so that it does not become confrontation or conflict. And it's, I think, in the interest, I think that is really the number one issue after stopping and defeating Russia's efforts in Ukraine. I think the competition with China and managing that competition is the number one issue for the world, and the world has an interest in China and the United States getting that right. I think countries in the world don't want to choose between those two countries, don't want to see a confrontation or conflict between the two of them. So I think that is really the number one item on the agenda for the United States and China, and in some sense for the entire international community, as we go into what is really a very new era now ahead of us.
Gentlemen, before I table my last question for both of you, Mr. Hadley, let me come back to your book. How would you put this briefly? What kind of value can any reader actually extract from your latest book?
The book is Handoff, the Foreign Policy George W. Bush Passed to Barack Obama. And it is really a way to give people a chance to step back and look at the history and to try to get an understanding of the context of the issues that are dealt with, how we got to where we are today. And based on that history, what do we learn from it that would guide us going forward into managing those issues? History can be a great teacher. It doesn't dictate the future, but it is the context for the future, and an understanding of that history is very important if you're going to try to engage productively in the future going forward. That's what I hope the book will do.
Mr. Hadley, let me ask you, you did mention about US-Pakistan relations in the previous decades being more transactional than having some form of strategic partnership in it. Let me ask each one of you, what would you suggest in terms of redefining that relationship based on this op-ed that both of you actually wrote in the New York Times on the war in Afghanistan? What do each of you think should be the future of US-Pakistan relations beyond Afghanistan?
Moeed, why don't you go first?
Sure. Look, Osama, I tied to the last question you asked, Steve, and for me, the world is now once again moving decidedly into a great power contestation kind of frame. We can debate whether it's going to be US-China, whether it's going to be US-China plus, what's that configuration. But I am analytically committed to figuring out what are the ways in which countries like Pakistan can avoid becoming part of that contestation and instead be the country that tries to help lower the temperature, at least in the region that it operates. A lot of people will say you're punching above your weight, but please remember it was Pakistan that opened up the channels for the US and China to talk to each other. The famous Henry Kissinger trip was actually facilitated by Pakistan. I'm not talking of that kind of sort of grand, entrance into the fray again. But the point is, if South Asia heats up, if connectivity suffers, if South Asian countries become proxies in this greater competition, everybody loses, including the US and China. So to me, the future of the US-Pakistan relationship, the number one goal has to be for Pakistan to convince the US that it is not looking to play camp politics. It wants to continue its integration, economic integration with the West, while keeping its very, very close and special relationship with China. Wherever these two can combine, Pakistan will benefit. And this brings me back to that conversation. You can't do this unless you can sit and have a strategic roadmap for the US-Pakistan relationship. If we only keep tactics, it's not going to happen. Exactly the same with China. I was very recently in China and exactly the same conversation where Steve talks about contestation. I'd add one line to it from the perspective of countries like Pakistan. The elephants shouldn't trample the grass. And that, I think, is the conversation for Pakistan and the US to have, and Pakistan and China to have. And I wouldn't put it beyond Pakistan, frankly, that we should sit down, bring US, China, and Pakistan together and have a conversation how to lower the temperature in the region we exist in. The US wants it, China wants it, Pakistan wants it. We just can't seem to find the way to get that done at this point.
And Mr. Hadley, your thoughts on the question then?
I think one of the developments here in the last 10 years or so has been the emergence of what I'll call middle powers. And I don't say that to put them down. I say that just to indicate the sort of weighting. These are countries like Pakistan, like India, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like Brazil, like South Africa. These are important countries. And I think they will have a greater role to play in the decade ahead than they played in the decade in the past. And while I think Moeed is right, they're not going to be in a position to broker, a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, or to broker the competition between the United States and China. But they can take off bite-sized issues on that, particularly in regional security context, where they can make a contribution to trying to lower the temperature and resolve festering issues. I think there is a role to play in diplomacy for those middle power countries. And I think you've seen it, for example, there have been the countries in that weight class, if you will, that have brokered prisoner exchanges and the like. I think there is a role to play for middle powers in active diplomacy to help resolve pieces of broader conflicts, if not the broader conflict itself. In terms of the United States and Pakistan, I think there are two things. One, the United States needs to pay attention to Pakistan, got to deal with the problem of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's got to deal with the challenge of China, it's got to deal with developments in the Middle East. I think the challenge for the United States is to really pay attention to Pakistan, and as Moeed had said, and I have said, to try to look at the U.S.-Pakistan relations in a strategic context. And I think for Pakistan, it has got to recognize the overhang of the Afghan war, and also recognize that many Americans assume that Pakistan has now basically become an ally of China. And I think Pakistan has to make clear that it has a much more sophisticated view of South Asia and wants the United States to play a role and wants to have a relationship with the United States. So I think there are burdens on both sides if the United States and Pakistan are going to come up with the kind of relationship that would be in the interest of both of those countries.
Just to add one point, let me give you a starting point. Climate change and poverty reduction. These are two areas that I think everybody agrees on. Can we isolate these and start working on them to make sure that they are not affected by whatever else is happening geopolitically in the region or otherwise? Then use these as building blocks. The bite-size chunks that Steve's talking about, to me, these are the most non-controversial ones which can get us going at least.
Mr. Hadley, Dr. Moeed, thank you for being part of the show today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Mr. Stephen Hadley and Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you'd like to stay informed on upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.